So what other things should people be considering when they're looking at getting their trademark done?
But one of the other, I talked about the wide range of twos in trademark law. There's also a principal register and a supplemental register, two
Okay.
different registers. So most people usually apply for the principal register. And then if for one reason or another they can't get on the principal register, sometimes they can move it to the supplemental register and get it registered on that. Being on the supplemental register doesn't have all the rights that you have on the principal register, but it still gives you more rights than you have under common law.
Okay. What are some of the distinctions between those three levels
Between the supplemental principal, you mean?
and common law?
Oh, common law. Okay.
All
So in
three.
common, I'm sorry.
All three.
Okay.
Like so in principle, you're like you own it and nobody can do anything. Is that kind of the way it works?
Well, let's start with common law. So under common law, if you use a mark, say I'm in Washington, D.C. Suppose I use a mark within Washington, D.C. and I use it with a service or a good. Then under common law, I have rights to use the mark within Washington, D.C. And if somebody else came and start using a confusingly similar mark, I could sue them in Washington, D.C. I couldn't sue them in a federal court because I don't have a federal registration.
Okay.
Okay, then if I went to a principal register, so now I filed the trademark application with the US government, the USPTO, as I said before, and I've actually got a federal registration. Now I have rights across the entire United States. So now nobody in California can start using my mark with similar goods or services. If I just had the common law rights, then maybe I'm using it in Washington, D.C., somebody else is using it in California, somebody else is using it in Chicago. You know, we all have our little areas that we can protect our mark, but nobody has overall rights in the United States.
Mm.
And then one of the problems that we run into is if somebody's using one mark in Washington, D.C., for example, and somebody else is using it in California, and then one of those two decides to file for a federal registration, then a conflict arises because somebody may have used it in California and they may have superior rights to it in California than the person that has a federal registration. You know, so there's things like that that go on. And then you had asked a bit about the supplemental register too. The supplemental register gives you federal rights through the whole United States, but there are certain limitations on a supplemental register. So if you have a mark on the principal register, after 5 years, you can file a declaration of incontestability, and that limits what people can attack your mark for 5 years once the declaration of incontestability is approved. So if you are on the supplemental register, you don't have the ability to do that. You cannot make your mark incontestable. But if you've been using it for 5 years, more than 5 years on the supplemental register, you can reapply to have it put on the principal register. If at that point it gets registered in the principal register, then 5 years later you can, actually, I don't even know if you have to wait 5 years. I think you do though. But at 5 years after that, you could ask for it to be declared incontestable.
And it sounds like, I mean, when you're talking all three, sometimes I'm of the mind, you know what? Let me just go for the best of the best. Let's just go for that. But it really does seem to make sense to really do it in steps, right? You of course do your more, maybe you start with common law and then you go to a principal and then supplemental. Is that usually how that works, or it just depends on their geographic reach and I guess the financial impact they hope to protect?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the applicant. I mean, some people have no aspirations to grow, so they'll use it in their little common local area and they'll rely on a common law mark. And other people want to protect the mark throughout the entire country, or they have plans on growing and they don't want somebody else to start using the mark in another state before they get to that state. And then they file a federal registration, an application for a federal registration. So it depends.
And I guess a supplemental is always the fallback if you don't get the principal.
Well, it's a fallback in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, we talked earlier about the auto repairs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I had one that was kind of generic, but not completely, and it might acquire distinctiveness through use, then sometimes the trademark office will say I can go to the supplemental register. But for something as generic as auto repairs, they're probably never going to let me go to the supplemental register.
Right. Right. Okay.